Good day to each and everyone. We now come to the lesson 2 of this webinar. This lesson is about the innovative strategies for teaching learning GMRC Part 1. Before anything else, allow me to introduce myself again. I am Professor Keshal D. Higakit. I am a values education teacher for 12 long years. And with that, I became an advocate of values education. For this lecture, I will be teaching you the innovative strategies for teaching and learning GMRC. And in this lesson, you will challenge yourself to attain the following learning outcomes. First, to discuss different approaches and strategies in teaching GMRC and give tips on how to process the activities effectively and demonstrate appreciation and value of effectiveness of this strategy. Strategies are important tools that facilitate learning. They involve creatively so that educators can look at things in different light, to think outside of the box, and to exchange paradigms. More than anything, teaching strategies bring out the desired results. The following approaches and strategies that we will be talking about in values education are the same strategies used in teaching good manners and right conduct. So here are the major approaches and strategies for values development, namely inculcation, moral development, clarification, value analysis, action learning, and transpersonal approach. However, we will create a special page for the PNU ACES approach later because this approach, which I believe has a very high probability of winning the hearts and minds of the learners of value. Again, we have here the major approaches in values education. We have here the first approach, which is the inculcation. So the purpose of inculcation is to instill or internalize certain values in students. So what are those certain values? Those are the values like kindness, honesty, generosity, and more positive values that students can instill or internalize while learning in this approach. So, the second purpose of inculcation is to change the values of students so they more nearly reflect certain desired values. The values that we are talking here are those negative values that should be exchanged and change it into more desired values. Now, so in the next column, we can see the methods or strategies in inculcation approach. And these are modeling, positive and negative reinforcement, mocking, nagging, manipulating alternatives, providing incomplete or biased data, games and simulation, role-playing, discovery learning, and storytelling. In addition, a lot of teaching is a form of inculcation. Part of it is when teachers repeat information to students hoping it will sink in. And in this approach, students are to follow teachers' instruction, answer the questions, and modify their behavior. They are to act in accordance with peer-specified values. Therefore, students here are forced to act according to specific desired values in this way of approach. So the second approach we have is the moral development. Here, the purpose of moral development is to help students develop more complex moral reasoning patterns based on a higher set of values, to urge students to discuss the reasons for their value choices and positions, not merely to share change in the stages of reasoning of students. This is important because it helps the learners in improving their beliefs, because it is possible that they will believe to do wrong things while they are growing up. That is why they should be educated or taught of what is right and wrong. So the strategies or methods in this approach are moral dilemma episode, with small group discussion, relatively structured and argumentative case study. By the way, The teachers in teaching the learners this approach should be open and communicate trust. Have respect and concern to your students' personal beliefs and values, and should stimulate an atmosphere of positive acceptance. So, in the moral development approach, the Kohlberg theory of moral development is also part of this topic or lesson, like yung pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional stages of Kohlberg theory. And an example of this is yung may mga certain situations or dilemmas na ibibigay ang mga GMRC teachers or values education teachers that will make the students use their moral reasoning. Now, we have here the third approach, which is the clarification. So, the purpose of this is to help the students become aware of and identify their own values and those of others. And in this purpose, the students can become aware of their own values and also the values of others. Now, the second purpose is to help students communicate openly and honestly with others about their values. So, this approach can also build the confidence of the learners to communicate openly, honestly, and their values to others, and also to help students both rational thinking and emotional awareness to examining their personal feelings, values, and behavioral patterns. So, learners here can be able to use both rational thinking and emotional awareness in order na ma-examine ang kanilang sariling nararamdaman, values, behavioral patterns with the help of methods and strategies used by this approach. And these methods are role-playing, games, simulations, contrived or real value-laden situations, in-depth self-analysis exercise, sensitivity activities, out-of-class activities, small group discussion, clarifying response, strategy or CRC values, grid, ranking group dynamics. And please take note that CRC is the most flexible and effective strategy in encouraging learners about his or her thoughts and ideas and her relation to others. Later, I will also give you an examples on how we can facilitate this approach. Now, let's move on to the fourth approach, which is the analysis. So, the purpose of analysis is to help students become aware of and identify their own values and those of others. To use logical thinking and scientific procedures in order to investigate social issues inherent to their immediate surroundings, to help students use rational and analytical processes in interrelating and conceptualizing their values. So dito sa analysis approach, students use their logical thinking, rational and analytical processes, and scientific procedures para malaman nila ang mga nangyayari o mga bagay-bagay sa kanilang paligid. And the learners here are regarded as rational beings who can attain the highest good by subordinating feelings and passions to logic and scientific methods, and these methods are structured rational discussion that demands application of reasons as well as evidence, testing principles, analyzing analogs, cases, debate research, individual or group study library, and filled with rational class discussions. So, the teacher's role in this approach is to develop the skills on gathering and organizing facts that is relevant to making value judgment, assess the truth through supporting evidence, and then evaluate the consequences. Now, let's proceed to the next approach, which is the action learning goes beyond thinking and feeling. So, the purpose of this approach is to provide students with opportunities and changes to discover and act on their values. So, to encourage students to view themselves as personal social interactive beings, not fully autonomous but members of a community or social system. So in this approach, values are seen in the interaction between the person and the society, and community-based learning experiences are being emphasized in this approach rather than the classroom-based learning experiences. So, the methods or strategies that may use in this approach are those methods listed for analysis and clarifications, as well as action project within the school and community, and skill practice in group organizing and interpersonal relations. So, skills practice in group organization and action projects or community outreach projects are also part of this approach. An example of this are community development program and networking activities. Now we have the last approach, which is the transpersonal approach. The purpose of this approach is to develop among students a higher level of consciousness and spiritual upliftment. It underscores the process of self-discovery and the significance of self-actualization to become a fully functioning person. So, we have here as the key word is the self-discovery. And the methods usually used here are rest and relaxation exercises, meditation and brief fantasizing, imagination, creativity and mind games, awareness activities. So, example of transpersonal approach are activities like cartoon making, collage making, and cutting of photos. So, this will enable the learners to self-discover. In the next slide naman, as what I have said, we will emphasize the values clarification strategies. Now, the following strategies are examples and commonly used strategies that illustrate how the valuing processes could be facilitated. Now, we have here first the values voting. This strategy is a rapid method to check if the learners stand in various issues and to affirm if it is to others. Now, for example, how many of you would be willing to stand up for what you believe in, even if it means losing your job? Raise your hands. An example question of that is, which of these are more inclined to people, ideas, or things? Now, the fourth choices naman, this strategy is a variation of values ranking, but compels the learners to make decisions between two competing alternatives. Now, for example, which are more of a leader or a follower? So, that kind of question is an example of forced choices. Now, the values continuum naman is it provides the learner with a great range of choices on certain issues that are not purely black or white, but with shades of gray. Now, an example of that is, how do you look at work in general? As compensation ba or as fulfillment? So the next one is strongly agree or strongly disagree. So this strategy helps the learner examine the strength of their feelings about a given value or issue. Now, example is, encircle the response that indicates how you feel about this statement. A person does not live by bread alone. So to answer this question, you have to follow the instruction that you need to encircle. If you are strongly agree, then encircle as A, AS as agree somewhat, DS as disagree somewhat, and SD as strongly disagree. So this is useful also in clarification of values. The next one we have is the value whips. This strategy possesses questions and issues for the learner to consider. The questions are normally items that the learner takes for granted. Now, for example, a question, what would you consider as an ideal workplace? Now, the unfinished sentences naman is the strategy that surfaces some indicators of the learner's value as manifested on one's attitudes, interests, convictions, likes, dislikes, goals, and etc. For example, 5 years from now, I hope to. So that is an example of unfinished sentences. The next one we have is an autobiographical questionnaires. This facilitates the awareness of the learner's life patterns. For example, recall the various works that you have engaged in and the benefits that this have contributed to you. Now, the pictures without caption or freedom board naman ay allow the learners to have a freedom of expression and at the same time explore their current thinking and feeling processes. Now, an example of that is on this Manila paper is a newspaper headline today. Write your reactions about it in the space provided. Or feel free to write on this board anything that you wish to express. There shall be no reprisals for whatever you have written. So the last strategy we have here is the coded papers. This strategy teaches the learners to become critical in their reading, and it is important for the educator to remember that these strategies are tools to achieve the purpose of helping the learners clarify their values. Now, let us begin to discuss the ACES methodology and phases of values learning. Now, in the Philippine Normal University presents a systematic and a purposive approach to the teaching values education. It is called as ACES approach or Affective Cognitive Experiences for Self-Integration, which attempts to employ both the inductive and as well as the deductive methods in the conduct of the lessons. Although the former inductive method is given more emphasis since certain principles and conditions of learning that activate the learner and make learning personal and meaningful are easier achieved through the inductive method. The uniquely personal and subjective nature of learning is the best attained through having the learner undergo the experiences by himself and also with others in group. Now, this learning approach is commonly called andragogy or the experimental learning approach. Here, the learner undergoes by himself or with others the uniquely and subjective nature of learning. This means that the learners are actively involved in planning, designing, implementing, and evaluating the learning objectives or the ILO or the intended learning outcomes. Now, generally, the experimental learning processes develops through our 4 stages, namely the activity, analysis, abstraction, and application. And it continues sa evaluation, which is the closing activity, and follows 4 phases of value learning. So again, this follows 4 phases of value learning. And please take note that this approach, the ACES teaching approach, is based on the confluent theory of education, which believes in the simultaneously development as the theory provides for the flowing together and interaction of the affective and cognitive elements in individual and group learning of the students. So this enhances the wholeness of his or her being, meaning magkasabay ang pag-unlad o paglago ng affective at cognitive aspects ng isang bata. Yan ang meaning ng confluent. Now, again, confluent is a process of holistic learning involving the body, mind, emotion, spirit, and so therefore, they learn multidimensionally about themselves and to others. Now, let's clarify first some terms of this approach. We have here kasi the affective and the cognitive. So, affective refer to the feeling or emotional aspect of experience and learning, while cognitive refers to the activity of the mind towards knowing an object or its intellectual functioning in the full grasp of the reality. It may be thing, person, or circumstance. Let us now talk about the phases of the PNU ACES approach. This approach has 4 phases again, which starts from the activity, then analysis, the abstraction, and next is application and closing activity. Now, let's us have first the learning trigger phase or activity. Now, learning is triggered by a carefully planned activity such as individual disclosure or self-inventory, group discussion, case study, listening to vignettes, role-playing, song analysis, panel discussion, moral dilemma strategy, and many others. Now, in this phase, the student starts to clarify or understand his own feelings, ideas, or thoughts about specific situation contained in the activity being done. Now, the next phase is the values clarification phase, or also known as analysis. Now, the clarification process takes a more in-depth analysis in the second phase of value learning, because learning obtained from self-analysis and or group discussion are analyzed and processed by the teacher facilitator. Now, analysis of the learning process has 2 phases, namely the affective processing and the cognitive or content processing. Now, let us have first the affective processing. Now, it involves personal reflections and insights which become part of the learner's affective development. And while the cognitive or the content processing is a cognitive analysis of the experience which is done through eliciting information and studying the content and concepts relevant to the lesson. And take note that in values clarification phase, where the student gets a better understanding about his options and values are better clarified. Now, let's proceed to the directive phase or inculcation phase, or known as abstraction. In this phase, the teacher become directive in this leading questions or remarks. He or she should already have highlighted the value focus of the lesson. Now, the facilitator enriches the learning which were processed in the analysis phase through cognitive and affective inputs, and also reinforce and supports the decisions made by students which he or she thinks are universally acceptable. Now, the 4th phase is the action phase, or action phase practical, or known as application. So this application is done where the learner is expected to transfer his affective and cognitive learnings into actual situations. Now, this could be the development of an action plan or assignment for internalizing the concepts learned. Now, the last is the evaluation or closing activity. Now, we have here 2 auxiliary but significant activities which are the mood setting and closing activities. Now, the mood setting is in the ACES methodology is not just the motivational statement, but a mini activity related to the content of the lesson. Its purpose is to create a conducive psychological climate for learning. And it is a pleasurable activity because it is free to the students from hang-ups, tensions, fears, or passivity. Now, it helps also to create an atmosphere of comfortability with one another, openness or initial attempts for self-disclosure. And also, it is an effective way of building good rapport in the class. Now, the closing activity naman may be a song, quotation, philosophical thought, recitation of a verse that could capture the sense of the lesson, and also to give an added impact to the effective learnings of the student that may have obtained, and keep them in high spirits for whatever commitment they may have resolved at the end of the lesson. Now, I think that would be all for the part 1. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope you had gained good insights through our discussion and would be able to apply this in your journey as future teachers.